East Prussia, late September 1942. Inside the Führer's war headquarters, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The conference room's heavy doors sealed in Germany's military elite, men decorated with iron crosses, their posture rigid, their expressions carefully blank. They knew what was coming. Everyone in that room understood they were about to witness a career execution, carried out not with bullets, but with words that cut deeper than any blade. Franz Halder stood at attention before the long table. As chief of the German General Staff, he'd orchestrated the military machine that conquered half of Europe. He'd planned lightning strikes through Poland and the audacious sweep through France that shocked the world. 4 years of victories bore his strategic fingerprints. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he would commit the one unforgivable act in Hitler's Reich, speaking an unwelcome truth. The subject weighing on every mind was a burning city on the Volga River. Stalingrad had become a meat grinder, consuming German divisions, block by blood-soaked block. For 60 days, Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army had been fighting through industrial rubble and shattered streets, measuring progress in meters rather than kilometers. The casualties mounted, the exhaustion deepened. And Franz Halder had done what good staff officers do. He'd calculated the cost. Halder's voice was measured, professional, as he laid out the situation. The Sixth Army had bled 80,000 men since August began. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under cover of darkness every night, fresh troops replacing the fallen. German supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe, where partisan attacks grew bolder by the week. And winter, that ancient killer of invading armies, was already sharpening its claws on the eastern horizon. The officers around the table knew these facts. Field commanders had been sending similar reports for weeks. But knowing something and saying it aloud before Hitler were entirely different acts. Halder pressed forward with his assessment, his words precise and damning. The numbers told an unambiguous story. Germany lacked the resources to finish what it had started in Stalingrad. Then Halder crossed the line from analysis to recommendation. He suggested the unthinkable: pause the offensive, consolidate defensive positions, prepare for winter, and resume in spring with proper logistics in place. In that moment, every calculation that made sense on paper became heresy. He'd questioned the Führer's judgment. He'd implied that Hitler's strategy might be flawed. In Nazi Germany, these were not professional disagreements. They were acts of treason. The silence that followed was suffocating. You could hear the creak of leather as officers shifted in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their own boots. Hitler's face transformed, first pale, then flushing crimson. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Quiet Hitler was worse than screaming Hitler. Everyone present knew this fundamental truth. "Withdrawal," Hitler repeated, loading the word with contempt. His voice remained low, controlled, more menacing for its restraint. He painted Halder as the architect of every setback, every moment of hesitation, every counseling of caution that had supposedly held back German victory. The accusations built like a prosecutor's closing argument, each word designed to strip away Halder's credibility before the assembled witnesses. Halder stood motionless. This was his Rubicon moment. He could retreat into apologies and qualifications, soften his words, preserve his position. Or he could finish what he'd started, knowing the cost. Every man in that room watched him choose. He chose to continue with the truth, spelling out the mathematics of disaster in methodical detail. The Sixth Army required 700 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing. On good days, the supply chain delivered perhaps 300 tons. As winter tightened its grip, even that inadequate figure would plummet. These weren't opinions or estimates. These were logistics, as immutable as geometry. Intelligence indicated the Soviets weren't collapsing, they were preparing a major counteroffensive. The German flanks relied on Romanian and Italian divisions equipped with obsolete anti-tank weapons. If the Red Army struck those vulnerable flanks, while German forces concentrated inside Stalingrad's ruins, the entire Sixth Army risked encirclement. Halder wasn't offering vague concerns or defeatist speculation. He was presenting a detailed strategic assessment that contradicted Hitler's vision of inevitable triumph. This specificity made Hitler angrier, not more convinced. He was using facts against faith, logistics against willpower, professional military analysis against ideological certainty. And in Hitler's worldview, belief could overcome any material reality. Hitler's voice rose, controlled rage giving way to shouting fury. Hitler's rebuttal was pure force of personality. He reminded everyone present how experts had declared his victories impossible, conquering France in 6 weeks when the General Staff predicted years of attritional warfare, transforming defeated Germany into the master of continental Europe. He'd proven the impossible possible through willpower and vision. Who was Halder to doubt that pattern? When Halder tried to respond, tried to explain he wasn't questioning past achievements, but presenting current mathematical realities, Hitler cut him off. Mathematics, logistics, caution, these were the language of the defeated. Wars were won through determination, through refusing to accept the possibility of failure. Stalin's forces were on the verge of collapse. Stalingrad was the key to everything. Once it fell, Soviet positions along the entire Volga would crumble, opening access to Caucasus oil fields and ultimate victory. Halder couldn't help himself. His professional training asserted itself despite the danger. At what cost, he asked, his voice rising to match Hitler's. Even if they ground their way to victory in Stalingrad, another month of brutal urban combat at minimum, they'd have an exhausted army holding an exposed salient deep in Soviet territory, winter closing in, and supply lines that couldn't possibly sustain operations. What kind of victory would that be? Hitler's hands slammed the table with a crack like a gunshot. The assembled generals flinched. The Führer's face was purple now, spittle flying as he denounced the pessimists and defeatists surrounding him. Men who saw obstacles instead of opportunities, who wanted to retreat at the first sign of difficulty. He ran through Halder's record of opposition, objecting to the French offensive, questioning the Soviet invasion, resisting every bold stroke that had delivered German victories. The accusation held partial truth. Halder had indeed expressed concerns about Hitler's more aggressive gambits, but he'd also executed those plans, often brilliantly, turning risky visions into operational reality. That nuance was lost on Hitler, who remembered only the resistance, never the competent implementation. In the Führer's binary worldview, anyone questioning him was automatically wrong, because Hitler was never wrong. Around the conference table, other generals sat frozen. Some privately agreed with Halder's assessment. They'd seen the reports from the front, knew the supply situation was critical, understood the risks, but not one would speak up. They learned that supporting criticism of Hitler's strategy was career suicide. Survival meant silence, even when silence enabled catastrophe. Halder made one last attempt, appealing to his record of faithful service to Germany. Hitler's response was withering. Halder had served his own timidity, his outdated general staff thinking, not the vision Germany required. The Reich needed generals who believed in victory, not accountants counting costs and cataloging obstacles.
Hitler turned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his most reliably obedient subordinate. The orders came crisp and final. Halder was relieved of command, effective immediately. General Kurt Zeitzler would replace him, a younger officer with Eastern Front experience and, hopefully, the aggressive spirit the position demanded. No discussion, no appeal, just termination. Halder removed the insignia from his collar and placed them on the polished oak table with quiet dignity. He'd known this outcome the moment he decided to speak honestly. Some truths carry price tags too steep for most men to pay. He rendered a formal salute, turned on his heel, and walked out. His military career was finished. 4 years guiding Germany's armies, decades of professional service, ended in a single confrontation lasting minutes. As Halder departed the headquarters, he carried the certainty that history would vindicate him. Every calculation he'd presented was accurate. Every concern he'd voiced was legitimate. And in the coming months, reality would prove him horrifically correct in ways even he might have preferred to be wrong about. 8 weeks later, almost to the day Halder had predicted, the Soviet counteroffensive exploded. November 19th, 1942. Red Army forces struck north and south of Stalingrad, precisely targeting the Romanian positions Halder had identified as vulnerable. The Romanians, undermanned and under-equipped with inadequate anti-tank capabilities, collapsed within hours. Their defensive lines shattered like glass. By November 23rd, 4 days after the offensive began, the encirclement was complete. Over 280,000 German soldiers, the entire Sixth Army, were trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket. Hitler's prized city had become a prison. Everything Halder warned about had materialized exactly as he'd outlined, down to the specific vectors of attack and the predictable results. The supply crisis Halder calculated with such precision now played out with mathematical inevitability. The Luftwaffe launched a massive airlift operation attempting to sustain the trapped army by air. They never came close. The minimum requirement was 700 tons daily. Most days, the aircraft delivered 100 tons or less. Many days, weather prevented flights entirely. Inside the pocket, soldiers slowly starved. Equipment failed from lack of fuel and spare parts. Medical supplies vanished, leaving the wounded to suffer without relief. Men froze to death in inadequate winter shelters, their bodies stiff by morning, their faces peaceful in the final sleep. The Sixth Army dissolved not through defeat in battle, but through the arithmetic Halder had presented: supply failing to meet demand, reality refusing to bend before willpower. The commanders trapped inside the pocket sent increasingly desperate radio messages requesting permission to attempt a breakout while combat capability remained. Hitler refused every request. He remembered Halder's advice about withdrawal and was determined to prove that determination could overcome logistics. The army would hold its ground. Relief forces would break through. Victory would be achieved through fighting spirit and refusal to accept defeat. But determination doesn't create food in empty warehouses. Willpower doesn't generate ammunition from thin air. Fighting spirit can't warm frozen soldiers or heal wounded men without medicine. The mathematics Halder presented proved inexorable, indifferent to ideology or belief. Numbers don't care about your convictions. By December, the Sixth Army was combat ineffective, units at quarter strength, too weak to mount coordinated operations. By January, soldiers were dying of starvation, reduced to eating horses, then leather, then nothing. By February 2nd, 1943, the survivors surrendered. Of the 280,000 men encircled, approximately 91,000 lived to raise white flags. Most would perish in Soviet captivity. Only about 6,000 ever saw Germany again. Halder watched this catastrophe unfold from forced retirement, maintaining detailed diaries that would later become crucial historical documents. He recorded his frustration at being proven right while being treated as if he'd been wrong. He documented precisely how his predictions materialized, step by terrible step. And he reflected on the fundamental dysfunction that had destroyed him and would ultimately destroy Germany itself. The problem Halder understood wasn't merely Hitler's personality or strategic incompetence. The problem was systemic. Hitler had created a structure where reality became whatever he declared it to be. Facts contradicting his vision were dismissed as defeatism. Officers presenting accurate assessments were accused of lacking fighting spirit. The entire military command apparatus had been corrupted by the imperative to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Halder attempted to be the exception, to maintain professional military standards of honest assessment and realistic planning. But in Hitler's Germany, professional competence was subordinate to ideological loyalty. Better to be wrong and faithful than right and critical. The yes-men survived and advanced, while truth-tellers were purged. The incentive structure guaranteed failure by punishing honesty. General Kurt Zeitzler, who replaced Halder,
initially brought the aggressive optimism Hitler craved. But within months, Zeitzler found himself presenting the same concerns about Stalingrad that Halder had voiced. The difference was timing. By then, the army was already trapped. Zeitzler's belated honesty came too late to prevent disaster, serving only to document it for future historians. Hitler's response to Zeitzler mirrored his treatment of Halder: dismissal of concerns, accusations of defeatism, insistence that willpower would prevail. Zeitzler lasted longer, having learned to couch criticisms more carefully, but eventually he too was dismissed after repeatedly requesting strategic retreats that might have saved German forces. He suffered a nervous breakdown in 1944 and was relieved of command, another casualty of the truth-telling curse. The pattern repeated throughout the remaining war years. Competent generals who spoke honestly were fired. Sycophants who told comfortable lies were promoted. German military operations became increasingly divorced from strategic reality, decisions made in a fantasy world that only existed in Hitler's imagination and the carefully filtered reports his staff learned to provide. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most capable tactician, managed the tightrope better than most. He learned to present realistic assessments while framing them to avoid direct contradiction with Hitler's worldview. Instead of requesting retreat, he'd propose flexible defense. Rather than withdrawal, he'd emphasize strategic repositioning. This semantic game occasionally worked, but it also meant Germany's finest military minds spent energy managing Hitler's ego rather than fighting the war effectively. The tragedy of Halder's dismissal transcended losing one capable staff officer. The incident broadcast a clear message throughout the Wehrmacht that telling the Führer the truth is more dangerous than losing battles. This created an atmosphere where officers at every level learned to distort or suppress information that might anger Hitler. Intelligence reports were softened to remove sharp edges. Casualty figures were minimized or creatively categorized. Enemy strength estimates were adjusted downward. Supply problems were described as temporary difficulties rather than systemic failures. This information distortion flowed upward through the command structure like pollution in a river, meaning that Hitler's strategic decisions were increasingly based on fictional assessments of reality.
He was making choices about divisions and offensives based on what subordinates thought he wanted to hear, rather than what was actually happening on the ground. This information gap widened progressively throughout 1943, 1944, and 1945, contributing to catastrophically poor decisions at every level of command. The Battle of Stalingrad became the perfect symbol of this dysfunction. Hitler insisted the city could be taken because he needed it taken for political and psychological reasons, while Halder said it couldn't be taken, or at least not at acceptable cost, because the logistics were impossible. Halder was fired for his assessment. Then, reality proved him correct in the most catastrophic way imaginable. But even after Stalingrad, Hitler learned nothing. He didn't recognize that firing advisors for honesty was counterproductive. Instead, he doubled down. The defeats must have resulted from incompetent or treasonous generals. The solution was more personal control, less reliance on professional military advice, greater trust in his own intuition over expert analysis. This pattern continued until Berlin fell. In 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hitler refused to release armored reserves because he remained convinced the landing was a feint and the real invasion would strike at Calais. His generals knew better, but had learned not to contradict too forcefully. By the time Hitler accepted that Normandy was the genuine invasion, effective counterattack was impossible. In 1945, as Soviet forces approached Berlin, Hitler was moving phantom divisions on maps, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counteroffensives with resources destroyed months earlier. His staff knew the situation was hopeless, but continued executing meaningless orders because they'd learned that truth-telling was punished, while obedient failure was merely unfortunate. Halder survived the war, arrested first by the Nazis after the 1944 assassination plot against Hitler, though he wasn't directly involved, then by the Americans as Germany collapsed.
He was ultimately used as a consultant for historical research about German military operations, providing detailed testimony about the dysfunctional relationship between Hitler and the general staff. He explained methodically how professional military planning had been subordinated to ideological fantasy. He documented the precise mechanisms through which Hitler's refusal to accept reality led to strategic disasters. In his later writings and interviews, Halder reflected on his firing with complex feelings. Being proven right offered cold comfort when hundreds of thousands died unnecessarily. Yet, he'd maintained his professional integrity when compromise would have been easier and safer. He told the truth when truth-telling was dangerous, and he'd paid the price for that choice. Some might call it principle, others might call it stubbornness. Halder saw it as simply doing his job the way he'd been trained, honestly assessing situations and providing recommendations based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. The lesson of Franz Halder's firing extends far beyond World War II military history. It's a case study in what happens when institutions prioritize loyalty over competence, when criticism is treated as betrayal, when leaders surround themselves with yes-men rather than experts willing to deliver unwelcome news. The pattern is recognizable across history and across different types of organizations: corporations, governments, religious institutions, any human hierarchy. Leaders who punish truth-tellers create systems where truth becomes increasingly rare. Subordinates learn to tell leaders what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Decisions get made based on comfortable fictions rather than uncomfortable facts. Eventually, reality asserts itself in catastrophic ways that could have been avoided if someone had been willing to listen to the Halders of the world. The tragedy isn't just individual, it's systemic, organizational, cultural. When you make honesty dangerous, you guarantee failure. When you reward flattery over accuracy, you build your strategy on sand. September 24, 1942 was the day Hitler fired his best general for telling the truth about Stalingrad. It was also the day Hitler guaranteed Stalingrad would become the catastrophe Halder predicted, because by removing the one advisor willing to speak honestly, he ensured no one else would try. The truth about Stalingrad became unspeakable, and unspeakable truth led to unspeakable tragedy. Franz Halder lived until 1972, long enough to see Germany rebuilt, to see the Wehrmacht have its reputation partially rehabilitated, to see historians recognize he'd been right about Stalingrad. But he also lived long enough to understand that being right mattered less than being believed, and that telling the truth cost him everything, while lying cost Germany far more. The firing of Franz Halder wasn't merely a personnel decision, or a moment of anger. It was a choice between reality and fantasy, between professional competence and ideological purity, between honest assessment and comfortable delusion. Hitler chose wrong. 280,000 men at Stalingrad paid the price for that choice, and the lesson stands as a warning for anyone tempted to shoot the messenger rather than hear the message. In the end, mathematics defeated willpower. Logistics defeated determination. Reality defeated ideology. But by the time these truths became undeniable, the cost of ignoring them had already been paid in blood and ash on the frozen banks of the Volga River. Franz Halder knew it was coming. He told everyone who would listen, and for that act of professional honesty, he was destroyed, though not as thoroughly as the army he tried to save.